June 14th, 1814. The morning rain fell upon London like tears from a morning sky, streaking the tall windows of St. George's Church, as if heaven itself wept for what was about to transpire within those hallowed walls. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the entrance of the nave, her fingers trembling against the ivory silk of her wedding gown, a garment she had not chosen and did not want, purchased with money her family did not possess, for a ceremony that felt more like an execution than a celebration. 200 faces turned toward her as the organ swelled, 200 members of society who had come not to witness love, but to observe the spectacular fall of a baron's daughter, sold like chattel to settle her father's gambling debts. She could feel their eyes crawling over her, drinking in every detail of her humiliation, and she lifted her chin with the same fierce pride her mother had possessed, touching the pearl earrings at her lobes as if drawing strength from that ghostly maternal presence. At the altar waited Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornbury, a man she had met precisely twice before this morning, a man whose cold grey eyes and severe countenance had earned him whispered epithets throughout the ton. He stood impossibly still, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, his signet ring bearing the raven crest of his ancient house, catching what little light penetrated the gloom. Eleanor's stepmother Lydia had told her everything, had explained with barely concealed satisfaction how the Duke had demanded Eleanor specifically as payment for the £40,000 her father owed, how he had refused all other forms of settlement, how he had looked upon her at Lady Pemberton's musical and decided she would be his. The cruelty of it burned in Eleanor's chest as she walked forward, each step bringing her closer to a fate she had not chosen, with a man she had every reason to despise. Her father would not meet her eyes from his place in the front pew, his shoulders hunched with shame, or perhaps relief that his debts would be cleared, while Lydia sat beside him in her finest lavender silk, her expression one of barely suppressed triumph. When Eleanor reached the altar, she could smell sandalwood, and something darker, could see the muscle twitching in Frederick's jaw as the vicar began to speak the ancient words that would bind them together until death. The ceremony proceeded with agonizing slowness, each phrase a chain wrapping tighter around her throat, until at last the vicar turned to her and asked if she would take this man as her husband, to honor and obey him all the days of her life. Eleanor looked into Frederick's unreadable grey eyes, saw her own reflection trapped there like a bird in a cage, and something inside her simply shattered. She gathered what moisture she could in her mouth, leaned forward as if to speak her vows, and spat directly into the face of the Duke of Thornbury before the gasping, horrified assembly of London's finest. The sound that rose from the assembled guests was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, a collective inhalation of horror that seemed to steal all the air from the church, followed by a silence so profound she could hear the rain hammering against the stained glass windows above. She watched as her saliva dripped down Frederick's cheek, watched his grey eyes widen for just a fraction of a second before that marble composure reasserted itself, and she braced herself for the blow that would surely come, for the rage that any man would feel at such a public humiliation. Behind her she heard Lady Harriet's strangled sob, heard the rustle of silk as women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, heard the low murmur of male voices thick with shock, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. But Frederick did not strike her. He did not shout or storm from the church or call for the marriage to be dissolved. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket with a deliberate slowness that made Eleanor's heart pound against her ribs, withdrew a pristine white handkerchief, and wiped his face with the same care one might use when cleaning spectacles. The muscle in his jaw twitched once, twice, 3 times, the only visible sign of whatever tempest might be raging beneath that glacial exterior. And when he had finished, He simply folded the handkerchief and returned it to his pocket, as if she had done nothing more offensive than sneeze in his direction. Eleanor stared at him, her defiance beginning to curdle into confusion, and she became suddenly aware of her stepmother in the front pew, of Lydia's expression of satisfaction that seemed entirely wrong for a woman whose stepdaughter had just committed social suicide. The vicar stood frozen at his pulpit, his prayer book trembling in his hands, clearly uncertain whether to continue or flee, and it was Frederick who broke the terrible silence, his voice low and steady as he addressed the terrified clergyman. "Continue," he said, and the single word carried such authority that the vicar immediately resumed the ceremony with renewed fervour, stumbling over words he had spoken 1,000 times before. When Frederick spoke his vows, his voice did not waver, did not betray any emotion beyond a sort of weary determination, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his face as he pledged to honour and cherish her until death parted them. The vicar turned to her once more, his eyes pleading with her not to cause another scene, and Frederick leaned close, so close that his breath stirred the fine hairs at her temple, and whispered words meant only for her ears. "You have been told lies," he murmured, "and one day you will know the truth of what your stepmother has done." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, felt her certainty crack like ice on a winter pond. But before she could respond, the vicar was prompting her for her vows, and she heard her own voice speaking the words that would bind her to this stranger forever, hardly knowing what she said, her mind spinning with the impossible suggestion that everything she believed about this marriage might be wrong. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. The carriage lurched forward into the grey afternoon, and Eleanor pressed herself against the velvet squabs, as far from Frederick as the confined space would allow, her wedding gown a prison of ivory silk that rustled with every jolt of the wheels over the cobblestones. The rain had not relented, hammering against the roof and streaming down the windows in endless rivulets that blurred the passing London streets into watercolour smears of grey and brown, and Eleanor fixed her gaze upon that distorted world rather than look at the man she had just married, the man whose face she had defiled before 200 witnesses, the man who sat across from her in perfect stillness, as if carved from the same stone as the church they had just fled. She could feel his eyes upon her, could sense him watching her the way a naturalist might observe some unfamiliar creature, and her skin prickled with awareness even as she refused to acknowledge his presence. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythm of rain and hooves and her own shallow breathing, and Eleanor found herself waiting for the violence she was certain must come, tensing her muscles against the blow that any man would surely deliver to a wife who had humiliated him so completely. But minutes passed, then an hour, and still Frederick did not move, did not speak, did not reach across the space between them to exact the retribution she deserved. When he finally stirred, Eleanor flinched so violently that her head struck the carriage wall, and she watched with wide eyes as he merely reached beneath his seat to withdraw a thick woolen blanket, holding it toward her with an expression she could not read. "You are shivering," he said, and his voice was lower than she remembered, rougher, as if the words cost him some effort. Eleanor stared at the offered blanket as if it were a serpent, her mind racing to understand what game he might be playing. But the cold had indeed seeped through her thin silk gown, and her teeth had begun to chatter despite her best efforts to control them. When she made no move to accept, Frederick simply leaned forward and draped the blanket across her lap, his fingers careful not to brush against her, and then he settled back into his seat and began to unknot his cravat with methodical precision. Eleanor clutched the blanket without meaning to, drawing its warmth around her shoulders, and found herself watching as Frederick unwound the starched linen from his throat to reveal a thin, white scar that ran from just below his ear to the hollow of his collarbone, a mark that spoke of some violence she could not imagine. "There is food in the hamper, if you are hungry," he said without looking at her, gesturing to the wicker basket that had been placed between them, untouched provisions from a wedding breakfast neither had attended. Eleanor said nothing, but some small part of her certainty crumbled as she watched this man who should have been her enemy offer comfort instead of cruelty, and she wondered for the first time if his whispered words at the altar might contain some fragment of truth she had been too angry to consider. The estate emerged from the gathering dusk like something out of a fever dream, its pale stone walls rising against the darkening sky with an elegance that stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs and replaced it with something cold and heavy that settled in her chest like a stone. She had expected grandeur, had braced herself for the ostentatious display of wealth that men like Frederick wielded as weapons against those they wished to diminish. But nothing could have prepared her for the sheer scale of Ravenscroft, for the endless windows that glittered with candlelight, for the sweeping drive lined with ancient oaks that had stood sentinel for generations, for the fountain at the center of the circular approach where carved ravens spread their wings in eternal flight. The carriage rolled to a stop before the massive front doors, and Eleanor remained frozen in her seat as Frederick descended without a word, her mind cataloguing every turret and tower of her gilded prison while her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A footman appeared at her door, livery immaculate despite the hour, and Eleanor forced her trembling legs to carry her down the steps and onto the gravel drive, where Frederick waited with that same unreadable expression he had worn throughout the endless journey. The household staff had assembled in the entrance hall, a sea of curious faces arranged in neat rows along the grand staircase that swept upward toward shadowed galleries hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge her bedraggled appearance with silent disdain. Frederick introduced her as the Duchess of Thornbury, and Eleanor heard the whispers that rippled through the assembled servants, knew they were cataloguing her ruined wedding gown and wild eyes, and the way she flinched when Frederick's hand hovered near her elbow without quite touching. A woman stepped forward from the ranks, her silver hair pulled back severely, but her eyes kind, and Frederick introduced her as Mrs. Fleming, the housekeeper who had run Ravenscroft since before he was born. Mrs. Fleming curtsied and spoke words of welcome that seemed genuine rather than rehearsed, and Eleanor found herself clinging to that small kindness, as Frederick led her up the staircase past generations of Ravenscrofts frozen in oil and gilt. He stopped before a door in the east wing, explaining that these would be her chambers, that his own rooms were in the west wing should she need anything. And Eleanor stared at him in confusion that must have shown plainly on her face because something flickered in his grey eyes, something that might have been sadness or understanding or perhaps simply exhaustion. He did not enter her rooms, merely opened the door and gestured for her to proceed, and Eleanor stepped across the threshold into a suite of chambers so beautiful that tears pricked unexpectedly at her eyes, a sitting room decorated in shades of blue and cream giving way to a bedroom dominated by a canopied bed hung with silk, and through the windows she could see the shadowed shapes of a rose garden silvered by the first light of a rising moon. Frederick bid her good night from the doorway, his voice formal and distant, and Eleanor watched him walk away down the corridor without once looking back, leaving her alone in her magnificent cage to wonder why the door had no lock and why her captor seemed determined to give her every freedom except the one she truly wanted. The days that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm of avoidance and proximity, of shared meals consumed in silence, so thick Eleanor could feel it pressing against her skin like the summer heat that had finally broken through the endless rain. Each morning she woke expecting something to change, expecting Frederick to appear at her door with demands she had been raised to understand were his legal right, but each morning brought only the gentle knock of the housemaid with fresh water and the soft inquiry of whether her grace required anything at all. Eleanor tested the boundaries of her captivity with the careful deliberation of a woman who had learned to expect the worst from men. Wandering first through the corridors nearest her chambers, then venturing further into the sprawling wings of the estate, and always she found doors unlocked and servants who smiled and curtsied, and never once suggested she should not be where she was. It was on the third day that she discovered the library, a cavernous room of mahogany shelves stretching toward ceilings painted with scenes of ancient myths, and Eleanor had stood in the doorway with her heart pounding as though she had stumbled upon some forbidden treasure rather than a collection of books any duchess might rightfully claim. She began spending her afternoons there, pulling volumes at random and curling into the worn leather chair by the window where the light fell golden across the pages. And it was there that Frederick found her on the fifth evening, her dinner growing cold in the dining room while she lost herself in a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that had been loved by some previous hand until the spine cracked easily open to favorite passages. He said nothing at first, merely stood in the doorway watching her with that unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize as his. Mask against the world, and Eleanor braced herself for a reprimand that never came. "I see you have found my mother's favorite," he said instead, his voice carrying that rough quality she noticed emerged only when something had caught him off guard. Eleanor looked down at the book in her hands, at the faded inscription on the flyleaf she had not thought to examine, and felt something shift in her understanding of the cold man she had married. The dinners grew less silent after that, stilted conversations about books giving way to something almost resembling companionship, though Eleanor still flinched when his hand moved too quickly and still watched him from beneath her lashes for signs of the cruelty she remained certain lurked beneath his patience. A letter arrived from Lady Harriet on the seventh day, its pages filled with worry and questions Eleanor could not bring herself to answer honestly, and she sat in her beautiful rooms wearing the dark colors of a woman in mourning, and wondered how long Frederick's strange game of kindness could possibly last before the trap finally closed around her. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel drew Eleanor from her afternoon reading on June 28th, and she peered through the library window to see an elegant curricle pulling up before the main entrance, its occupant a fair-haired gentleman whose easy smile and fashionable attire marked him as someone from Frederick's world rather than hers. She learned at dinner that evening that Lord Philip Montague had arrived for an extended visit, Frederick's cousin and closest friend, and Eleanor watched the way the two men interacted with a curiosity she could not quite suppress, noting how Philip's presence seemed to loosen something in Frederick's rigid bearing, how laughter occasionally escaped lips she had only ever seen pressed into stern lines. The days that followed brought a new dynamic to Ravenscroft, Philip's cheerful conversation filling the silences that had grown almost comfortable between Eleanor and her husband, and she found herself retreating more often to the quiet corners of the estate, where she might observe without being drawn into exchanges that left her feeling exposed and uncertain. It was on the third day of Philip's visit that Eleanor found herself wandering past Frederick's study in the late afternoon, the door left carelessly ajar in a way that would never have happened had guests not disrupted the household's careful routines, and she might have continued on her way had she not heard her own name spoken in Philip's curious tenor. She froze in the shadowed alcove where heavy curtains framed the window overlooking the rear gardens, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed herself against the wall and listened to words that would shatter everything she believed about her marriage and the man she had wed. Philip was asking why Frederick had not simply told Eleanor the truth, why he allowed her to believe he had demanded her hand as payment for her father's debts, and Frederick's reply came low and rough with something that sounded almost like pain. "I offered to forgive the debt entirely," Frederick said, the words landing like stones in Eleanor's chest. I wanted nothing from Ashworth but his signature on the papers absolving him of the £40,000. Philip made a sound of disbelief, and Frederick continued, his voice growing harder as he explained how Lady Lydia had come to him privately, how she had negotiated Eleanor into the arrangement in exchange for her silence about certain indiscretions and a sum of money that would secure her own daughter's futures, how Eleanor had been sold by her stepmother with her father's weak-willed consent, while Frederick had been told Eleanor knew and had agreed to the match willingly. Eleanor pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sob that rose in her throat, her mind reeling as she heard Frederick confess to Philip that he had realized the truth too late, had seen Eleanor's hatred at the altar, and understood that she believed him a monster who had purchased her like chattel. "She hates me," Frederick said quietly, "and I cannot blame her for it when she believes I am the architect of her misery rather than merely another fool caught in her stepmother's web." And Eleanor heard in his voice a weariness and resignation that pierced something deep within her chest that she had thought too armored to feel anything at all. Eleanor did not go down to dinner that evening, sending word through the housemaid that she was unwell, and she spent the hours until nightfall pacing the length of her chambers with her thoughts churning like storm waters against a rocky shore, her mind returning again and again to the words she had overheard, and the implications that rewrote every interaction she had shared with the man she had married. She had hated him with such conviction, had built her understanding of their situation upon the foundation of his cruelty and her victimhood, and now that foundation had crumbled to reveal something far more complicated beneath, a truth that cast her stepmother as the architect of her misery, and Frederick as merely another piece moved about Lydia's chessboard. The clock on her mantel struck 9 in the evening when Eleanor finally gathered her courage and descended the grand staircase, her slippers silent on the polished wood as she made her way toward the library where she somehow knew Frederick would be, drawn to that room as surely as she herself had been drawn to it in the weeks since her arrival. She found him exactly where she expected, standing before the fireplace with one arm braced against the mantel and a glass of amber liquid dangling from his fingers, and he turned at the sound of the door opening with surprise, flickering across his features before he could school them into their usual careful neutrality. Eleanor closed the door behind her and stood with her back pressed against it, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it across the candle-lit expanse of the room. "I know the truth," she said, and her voice emerged steadier than she had expected, strengthened perhaps by the hours she had spent rehearsing this moment. "I heard you speaking with your cousin this afternoon, and I know that you offered to forgive my father's debt entirely, that you never demanded me as payment, that my stepmother negotiated me into this arrangement for her own gain while telling me you had purchased me like livestock at auction." Frederick's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Eleanor to catalogue them all, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like relief before settling into a guarded watchfulness that made her chest ache in ways she did not fully understand. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly, his voice rough with that quality she was learning to recognize as genuine feeling breaking through his careful control. "I realized at the altar that you had been deceived, but I thought you would never believe me over your own family, and I hoped that time might allow you to see the truth for yourself." Eleanor crossed the room on unsteady legs, stopping when she stood close enough to see the firelight reflected in his dark eyes, close enough to notice the tension in his jaw and the way his knuckles had gone white around his glass. "I spat in your face," she whispered, and the words carried all the horror and shame that had been building in her since that afternoon. "I stood before God and 200 witnesses and spat in the face of a man whose only crime was being deceived as thoroughly as I was, and I am so deeply sorry, Frederick." His Christian name fell from her lips without conscious thought, and she watched something in his expression crack open at the sound of it, something vulnerable and hopeful that made him look younger than his 32 years. The days that followed their midnight confession in the library unfolded with a tentative sweetness that Eleanor had never imagined possible in this marriage she had entered with such fury and despair, and she found herself waking each morning with something that felt dangerously close to anticipation, wondering what new facet of Frederick Ravenscroft she might discover before the sun set again over the rolling hills of his estate. They began walking together in the rose garden after breakfast, a habit that started on July 1st when Frederick appeared at the morning room door and asked if she might care to see the new blooms that had opened overnight, and Eleanor had accepted with a careful casualness that belied the way her heart had quickened at the sight of him standing there, with sunlight catching the hints of auburn in his dark hair. The walks became longer as the days progressed, winding through the formal gardens and out into the wilder meadows beyond, and their conversations deepened in kind, moving from safe topics like books and estate management to more dangerous territory, the shadowed places where they kept their wounds and their longings. It was during their walk on July 8th that Eleanor finally asked about the scar on his neck, the thin white line she had first glimpsed during their carriage ride from London, and Frederick's step faltered for just a moment before he answered in a voice gone rough with old pain, telling her of a childhood accident that was no accident at all, of a father whose rages had been legendary and whose hand had been as quick with violence as his tongue had been with cruelty, of a boy who had learned to become stone because stone could not bleed. Eleanor had stopped walking then, turning to face him in the dappled shade of an ancient oak, and she had reached up without thinking to touch the scar with gentle fingertips, watching his eyes flutter closed at the contact, as if her touch were something precious rather than a liberty she had no right to take. They stood that way for several heartbeats, her fingers against his throat where she could feel his pulse racing beneath the thin skin. And when she finally let her hand fall away, she saw something new in his expression, something hungry and hopeful that made warmth bloom low in her belly in ways she did not fully understand. The days grew warmer as July progressed, and Eleanor found herself abandoning the dark colors she had worn like mourning clothes, choosing instead the lighter muslins and soft pastels that Frederick's housekeeper had quietly added to her wardrobe, and she noticed the way his gaze lingered when she appeared in a gown of pale yellow or soft rose. Frederick began teaching her to ride properly on July 10th, his hands steady and warm as he adjusted her position in the saddle, and Eleanor discovered that she no longer flinched from his touch, but rather leaned into it, craving the connection that had once seemed so threatening. She realized one evening as she watched him reading by firelight, his brow furrowed in concentration and his lips moving slightly over difficult passages, that she no longer wished to escape this marriage, that somewhere between the spitting and the walking and the slow revelation of his wounded heart, she had begun to want something far more terrifying than freedom. The morning of July 18th, 1814, dawned golden and warm over Ravenscroft estate, and Eleanor descended to breakfast with a lightness in her step that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had arrived here just over a month ago, her heart heavy with hatred and her mind filled with dark imaginings of the cruelties that awaited her at the hands of the man she had been forced to marry. She found Frederick already seated at the table, his dark head bent over correspondence, as was his habit, and he looked up at her entrance with that softening around his eyes that had become increasingly frequent in recent days, a warmth that made something flutter in her chest each time she witnessed it. The footman had just finished, pouring her tea when the butler appeared with the Morning Post on a silver tray, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of a familiar violet seal pressed into the wax of one particular letter, the distinctive mark of Lady Harriet Sinclair that she would have recognized anywhere. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the pages, her eyes moving rapidly across Harriet's elegant script, and she felt the blood drain from her face as the words registered in her mind, each sentence landing like a blow to the fragile happiness she had been building in these quiet weeks away from London. Frederick noticed immediately, setting aside his own correspondence and rising from his chair with concern etched across his features, and he crossed to her side of the table with a question in his dark eyes that Eleanor could not bring herself to answer, instead thrusting the letter toward him with fingers that would not stop shaking. She watched his expression transform as he read, watched the concern give way to something colder and more dangerous, watched the muscle in his jaw begin to twitch in that, till she had learned, meant he was fighting to control his temper. Harriet wrote that Lady Lydia had been very busy in their absence, spinning tales throughout every drawing-room and ballroom in London about her poor stepdaughter imprisoned in the country estate of a brutal duke, painting pictures of Eleanor locked in towers and denied food and beaten for the slightest disobedience, turning the scandal of the wedding day into an ongoing tragedy that had all of society clucking with sympathy for the victim and outrage at her monstrous husband. The gossip had grown so pervasive that Harriet feared Eleanor's reputation might never recover, that even if she returned to society someday, the stain of victimhood would cling to her forever. And Frederick's hands clenched so tightly around the paper that Eleanor feared he might tear it in two. She reached up without thinking to touch the pearl earrings she wore, her mother's earrings, and she thought of the woman who had given them to her, a woman who had faced down adversity with grace and spine of steel, and something hardened inside Eleanor's chest as she met Frederick's furious gaze. "We cannot let her win," Eleanor said quietly, and Frederick's expression shifted from rage to something that looked very much like pride. "Then we shall go to London," he replied, "and we shall show them all exactly how wrong they are." The evening of July 19th, 1814, found Eleanor and Frederick sequestered together in the library that had become their sanctuary, the fire crackling low in the grate despite the summer warmth outside, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with leather-bound volumes, and the settee where they sat closer together than propriety would have allowed in any London drawing-room, though propriety seemed a distant and irrelevant concern when measured against the weight of the decision that lay before them. Eleanor had spent the entire day turning Harriet's letter over in her mind, reading and rereading the words until they had burned themselves into her memory, and with each pass her resolve had hardened like steel being tempered in flame, the initial shock and despair giving way to something far more powerful, a cold and determined fury at the stepmother who had orchestrated her suffering, and now sought to compound it with lies designed to destroy whatever happiness Eleanor might find. She looked at Frederick now, at the strong line of his jaw and the concern etched in his dark eyes as he watched her, and she felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This man who had been painted as her monster, deserving so much better than the whispers that followed his name through ballrooms he never deigned to enter. "I want to go to London," Eleanor said, and her voice was steady, despite the fear that fluttered beneath her breastbone like a caged bird. "I want to attend Lady Pembroke's ball, and I want to stand before every person who has believed Lydia's lies and show them the truth of our marriage." Frederick's hand found hers on the cushion between them, his fingers warm and strong as they interlaced with her own, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the intimacy of the gesture, at the way such a simple touch could send warmth spreading through her entire body. "You understand what that will mean," he said quietly, his thumb tracing slow circles against her palm. "They will scrutinize your every expression, your every word, looking for cracks in the facade, and society can be unutterably cruel to those who disappoint their expectations." Eleanor turned to face him more fully, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely him that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "I am not afraid of society," she replied, lifting her chin with the same defiance she had shown at the altar, though the emotion behind it had transformed entirely. "I am the Duchess of Thornbury, and I will not cower in the country, while a woman who sold me for her own gain destroys my reputation with comfortable lies." Something shifted in Frederick's expression then, something heated and admiring that made Eleanor acutely aware of how close they sat, of the way the firelight turned his features golden and soft, and he leaned toward her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You magnificent creature," he murmured, and Eleanor felt herself swaying toward him as if pulled by an invisible thread, their faces inches apart, his breath warm against her lips. The sharp crack of a log shifting in the fireplace made them both start and pull back, the moment shattered but not forgotten, hanging between them like a promise yet to be fulfilled. And Frederick cleared his throat before speaking of modistes and ball gowns and the campaign they would wage together against the poison Lydia had spread. The afternoon of July 25th, 1814, brought Madame Beaumont and her army of assistants to Ravenscroft estate, their carriages laden with bolts of silk and satin and muslin in every shade imaginable. And Eleanor stood in the centre of her sitting-room, feeling rather like a dressmaker's form, as the diminutive Frenchwoman circled her with measuring tape and pins and a critical eye that missed nothing. She had been poked and prodded and measured for what felt like hours, trying on partially constructed garments and standing still while fabric was draped and pinned and adjusted. And she was just beginning to wonder if she might expire from boredom when Madame Beaumont produced a length of emerald silk so luminous it seemed to glow with its own inner light, the color of summer leaves with sunlight filtering through them, the exact shade of Eleanor's own eyes when she was happy or angry or feeling anything at all with intensity. "This one," Madame declared in her heavily accented English, "this is the gown for the ball," and as her assistants helped Eleanor into the half-finished creation, she felt something shift inside her chest, some recognition of the woman she was becoming in this place she had once thought of as her prison. The gown was cut lower than anything Eleanor had ever worn, skimming the curves she had always hidden beneath modest necklines, and gold thread had been worked into the bodice in delicate patterns that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and she was so absorbed in staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror that she did not hear the door open behind her. "Frederick," Madame Beaumont said with evident pleasure, "you must see what I have created for your Duchess." And Eleanor turned to find him standing in the doorway with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded that made her breath catch and her cheeks flush with sudden heat. He said nothing for a long moment, simply stood there staring at her as if she were a vision he could not quite believe was real, and Eleanor felt herself standing straighter under his gaze, felt beautiful in a way she had never felt before, not merely acceptable or presentable, but truly beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made a man forget how to speak. "You look," Frederick began, and then stopped, swallowing hard, and Eleanor watched the movement of his throat with fascination, watched the way his hands clenched at his sides as if he were fighting some internal battle for control. Madame Beaumont was watching them both with knowing eyes and a small, satisfied smile, and she shooed her assistants from the room with rapid French before following them out and closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Frederick crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes and the rapid pulse beating at the base of his throat. "You are magnificent," he said softly, and the word wrapped around her like silk, and Eleanor understood in that moment that everything between them had changed irrevocably, that they were balanced on the edge of something neither of them could take back. The night of July 31st, 1814, wrapped Ravenscroft estate in silver moonlight and the heavy scent of roses at their summer peak, and Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, despite the lateness of the hour, her mind spinning with thoughts of tomorrow, and the ball, and the hundreds of eyes that would scrutinize her every movement. And so she had slipped from her bed, and wrapped herself in a white cotton wrapper over her nightgown, and made her way through the silent house to the garden that had become her sanctuary in these strange and wonderful weeks. The fountain at the garden's center caught the moonlight and scattered it like diamonds across the dark water, and Eleanor stood beside it with her bare feet cool against the stone pathway, breathing in the perfume of the roses and trying to quiet the fear that churned beneath her breastbone. And she did not hear Frederick approach until his voice came soft and low from behind her, asking if she too found sleep impossible on this night before battle. He had removed his cravat, and his collar lay open at his throat, and in the moonlight he looked younger somehow, less guarded, the sharp angles of his face softened by shadow and silver light, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict at the sight of him, at the realization of how much had changed since that terrible morning in the church, when she had spat in the face of this man who now felt like the only solid ground beneath her feet. "I am afraid," she admitted, and the words came easier than they once would have, this new honesty between them still fragile but growing stronger with each passing day, and Frederick moved to stand beside her at the fountain's edge, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of her wrapper. "You have nothing to fear," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the dancing water. "You are braver than you know, and stronger than anyone who will be in that ballroom tomorrow, and I will be beside you through every moment." Eleanor turned to face him then, this man she had hated so completely, and now found herself unable to imagine living without. And she saw in his dark eyes the same fear and hope and longing that burned in her own chest, and before she could think better of it, she was speaking the words that had been building inside her for weeks. "I was so wrong about you," she whispered, "so terribly wrong, and you have been patient and kind when I deserved neither, and I do not know how to thank you for showing me who you truly are." Frederick's hand came up to cup her face, his palm warm against her cheek, and Eleanor leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion long suppressed. "I fell in love with you," he said, "despite every reason not to, despite your hatred and your defiance and the way you looked at me like I was a monster. I fell in love with your courage and your spirit and the fire in your eyes." And Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, tasting salt and moonlight, and the promise of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The night of August 1st, 1814, blazed with the light of 500 candles in Lady Pembroke's ballroom, as Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase with Frederick's arm solid and warm beneath her gloved fingers, and she could feel the eyes of all London turning toward them like flowers following the sun, 300 faces tilting upward in shock and curiosity and barely concealed hunger for scandal, and for one terrible moment she thought her legs might fail her entirely. The emerald silk of her gown caught the candlelight and scattered it like green fire across the marble steps, and she heard the gasps ripple through the crowd below like stones thrown into still water, heard the whispers begin their serpentine journey from lip to ear to lip again, and she felt Frederick's hand cover hers where it rested on his arm, his touch steady and sure and warm even through the barrier of their gloves. They descended together, step by measured step, and Eleanor held her chin high, despite the terror that clawed at her throat, despite the knowledge that half the people in this room believed she was a prisoner in her own marriage, and the other half thought her mad for spitting in the face of one of England's most powerful men. The orchestra had fallen silent at their entrance, and now hovered in that breathless pause between movements, and in that silence Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like distant cannon fire, could hear the rustle of silk and the sharp intake of breath from a woman in yellow standing near the bottom of the stairs. Frederick led her into the ballroom proper, and the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses, and Eleanor saw the shock on their faces transform into something else as they took in the way Frederick looked at her, the way his dark eyes softened when they met hers, the way he held her as if she were the most precious thing in all of England rather than a burden he had been forced to bear. Lady Harriet reached them first, her dear face shining with tears and relief as she grasped Eleanor's free hand and squeezed it tight, and Eleanor felt some of the ice in her chest begin to thaw at the sight of her friend, at the proof that not everyone in this glittering room wished her ill. The orchestra struck up a waltz as if on command, and Frederick turned to Eleanor with a question in his eyes, and when she nodded, he swept her onto the dance floor before the assembled masses, claiming her publicly and irrevocably as his duchess and his choice. And as they spun through the first measures of the dance, Eleanor caught sight of her stepmother Lydia, standing rigid with fury near the refreshment table, her face pale as milk beneath her rouge, and Eleanor smiled for the first time that evening, a smile that felt like a blade drawn from its sheath. The hour of 11 drew near, and Eleanor felt the moment approaching like a storm gathering on the horizon, felt it in the way Lydia's eyes followed her across the ballroom with increasing desperation, felt it in the whispers that swirled around her stepmother like carrion birds circling a dying animal. And when she saw Lydia move toward the refreshment table with a champagne glass clutched in her trembling fingers, Eleanor knew the time had come to end this charade once and for all. She glanced at Frederick where he stood 10 feet away speaking with Lord Pembroke, and he met her eyes with a small nod that said everything, that said he trusted her, that said this was her battle to fight and her victory to claim, and Eleanor felt her spine straighten with a courage she had not known she possessed as she made her way through the glittering crowd toward the woman who had sold her like livestock at market. "Lydia," she said, and her voice carried clear and strong across the sudden hush that fell around them. "I believe you have been telling tales about me to anyone who would listen." And the crowd pressed closer like moths to flame, hungry for scandal, hungry for blood, and Eleanor felt their attention like a physical weight upon her shoulders, but she did not falter. Her stepmother's face contorted through several expressions before settling on wounded innocence, her champagne glass shaking so violently that golden droplets spilled onto her ivory gloves, and she said in a voice pitched to carry, "Eleanor, my dear child, I have only ever wanted what was best for you, only ever tried to protect you from a man who bought you like a prize mare." The gasps that rippled through the crowd were everything Eleanor had anticipated, but she was ready now, armed with truth and righteous fury and the love of the man who watched her from across the room with pride blazing in his dark eyes. "That is a lie," Eleanor said, "and you know it is a lie because you are the one who negotiated the terms. You are the one who demanded I be included when the Duke offered to forgive my father's debts entirely. You sold me to secure your own daughter's futures, and then told me he had demanded me as payment." The silence that followed was absolute. 300 people holding their breath as the truth hung in the air like smoke after cannon fire. And Eleanor saw her father standing pale and shaken near the entrance, saw the moment he finally understood what his wife had done in his name. Lydia's mask crumbled then, her face twisting with ugly rage as she hissed, "You ungrateful girl! Everything I did was to save this family from ruin." and Eleanor smiled the smile that felt like a blade drawn from its sheath as she replied, "No, Lydia, everything you did was to save yourself, and now everyone knows it." The crowd parted as Lydia fled toward the doors, her reputation in tatters behind her, and Eleanor felt Frederick's hand warm and solid on the small of her back as he appeared beside her, and she leaned into his strength as the orchestra struck up another waltz, and the ton began to whisper not of scandal, but of vindication. The carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones of Mayfair as the clock struck 2 in the morning on August 2nd, 1814, and Eleanor sat pressed against Frederick's side, with her heart still racing from the triumph of the evening, still feeling the echoes of vindication singing through her blood. And when his hand found hers in the darkness of the carriage, she turned to look at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat, something raw and hungry and tender all at once, that told her tonight would be different from all the nights that had come before. The London townhouse rose before them like a promise kept, its windows dark except for the single lamp left burning in the entrance hall, and when Frederick helped her down from the carriage, his hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary, and Eleanor felt the heat of his touch burn through the emerald silk of her gown like a brand upon her skin. They climbed the stairs together in silence, but it was not the cold silence of their wedding day, not the wary silence of those first terrible weeks. It was a silence thick with anticipation and possibility, a silence that hummed with everything they had not yet said, and everything they were about to become. Frederick led her to the master bedroom rather than the separate chambers she had occupied before, and when he closed the door behind them, Eleanor felt no fear, felt nothing but a fierce and tender wanting that she had never allowed herself to feel before this moment. She turned to face him in the candlelight, and saw that his hands were trembling slightly as he reached for her, and she loved him more in that moment of vulnerability than she had ever loved anything in her 26 years of living, loved him for his patience and his gentleness and his unwavering faith that she would come to him when she was ready. Eleanor reached up and unfastened her mother's pearl earrings with steady fingers, placed them carefully on the bedside table, where they gleamed like twin moons against the dark wood, and then she stepped into Frederick's arms and kissed him with all the passion and gratitude and desperate love that had been building in her heart for weeks. He extinguished the candles one by one until only moonlight remained, silver and soft through the tall windows, and when he laid her down upon the bed and whispered her name like a prayer, Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, tears of joy and relief, and the overwhelming knowledge that she had found her home at last, not in these walls of stone and silk, but in the arms of this man who had waited for her, who had loved her, even when she gave him nothing but hatred and scorn. The summer dawn found them tangled together in the sheets. Frederick's hand splayed protectively across her stomach, as if he already knew what that night had kindled within her, and Eleanor pressed her lips to the scar on his neck, and smiled against his skin as the first bird-song drifted through the open window. The days that followed their first true night together unfolded like the pages of a book Eleanor had never dared to dream she might read, each morning bringing new discoveries about the man she had married, and each evening offering fresh opportunities to explore the depths of their connection. And as August stretched before them, in an endless ribbon of golden sunshine and whispered promises, Eleanor felt herself becoming someone new, someone who laughed freely and loved without reservation, and no longer flinched at the sound of her own happiness. Frederick changed too in ways both subtle and profound, the cold mask he had worn like armor falling away piece by piece, until Eleanor could scarcely remember the forbidding duke who had stood silent at the altar while she spat in his face. and in his place stood a man who smiled at her across the breakfast table with such unguarded warmth that it made her chest ache. A man who reached for her hand as they walked through Hyde Park and pressed kisses to her temple when he thought no one was watching. A man whose laugh she had come to treasure more than any jewel in his family's considerable collection. They remained in London for 2 weeks after the ball, attending dinners and musicales and garden parties where society fell over itself to welcome the Duchess of Thornbury into its glittering fold, and Eleanor found a wicked satisfaction in watching the same people who had whispered about her misfortune now clamouring for her attention and approval, though she was careful to extend her genuine warmth only to those who had shown her kindness before her triumph, chief among them Lady Harriet, who wept with joy at seeing her friend so transformed by love. But it was the quiet moments Eleanor treasured most, the lazy mornings when Frederick would read aloud to her from the newspapers while she sipped her chocolate, the afternoons when they would lose themselves in the cool shadows of the British Museum or wander through the booksellers on Paternoster Row, the nights when the boundaries between them dissolved entirely, and Eleanor learned that passion could be both tender and fierce, that a man's strength could be offered rather than imposed, that surrender was not defeat, but rather victory of the sweetest kind. When they finally returned to Ravenscroft Estate in the last week of August, the countryside welcomed them with fields of ripening wheat and hedgerows heavy with blackberries, and Eleanor stood at her window on that first morning home and marvelled at how different everything looked when seen through the eyes of love rather than resentment, how the rose garden below seemed to bloom more vibrantly and the sky stretched more endlessly blue than she had ever noticed before. She did not yet know that she carried Frederick's child within her, did not understand why the scent of certain foods made her stomach turn, or why she felt so weary by mid-afternoon, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world at last. And when Frederick came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, Eleanor leaned back into his embrace and whispered that she loved him, and his arms tightened around her as he murmured the words back against her skin. September arrived at Ravenscroft Estate with the first hints of autumn colour touching the edges of the oak leaves, and a crispness in the morning air that made Eleanor pull her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she stood at her bedroom window watching the sun rise over the gardens she had come to love so dearly. And it was on one such morning in the second week of that golden month that she first began to suspect the truth that would change everything. For she had missed her courses twice now, and the smell of kippers at breakfast had sent her fleeing from the dining room, with her hand pressed over her mouth, while Frederick called after her in alarm. The physician arrived from the village that very afternoon at Frederick's insistence, a kindly grey-haired man named Dr. Whitmore, who had delivered Frederick himself some 32 years prior, and when he emerged from Eleanor's chambers with a knowing smile and confirmed what she had already begun to hope in the secret chambers of her heart, Eleanor watched her husband's face transform from worried concern to stunned disbelief to radiant, overwhelming joy in the space of a single heartbeat. Frederick crossed the room in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms with such tender reverence that Eleanor laughed against his chest, and when he pulled back to look at her, there were tears glistening in his dark eyes, tears that this proud and stoic man made no effort to hide or explain away, and he whispered that she had given him everything he had never dared to want, a love he did not deserve, and now a child to carry that love forward into generations yet to come. The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of tenderness, as Frederick became almost comically protective, insisting that Eleanor rest whenever she looked the slightest bit fatigued, and personally supervising the preparation of every meal to ensure nothing might upset her delicate condition. And though his hovering occasionally made her want to scream with frustration, Eleanor found she could not truly resent his care when she saw how his hand trembled each time he placed it gently against the curve of her still flat stomach. Lady Harriet arrived for an extended visit in late September and wept with joy at the news, declaring that she had never seen Eleanor looking more beautiful or more content, and the two friends spent long afternoons in the rose garden discussing names and nursery decorations, while Frederick watched from his study window with a smile he could not seem to suppress. Letters arrived from London bearing congratulations from society matrons who had once whispered behind their fans about the scandalous altar incident, and Eleanor took particular satisfaction in penning gracious replies that revealed nothing of her private amusement at their transparent attempts to curry favour with the future mother of the next Duke of Thornbury. For she had learned that the best revenge was simply to live well and love deeply, and let her happiness speak louder than any words she might have offered in retort. October brought with it the first true chill of approaching winter, and a transformation in Eleanor that went far beyond the gentle swell of her belly, now visible beneath her mourning gowns. For she had become in these months not merely a duchess in name, but a woman fully awakened to her own worth and power, a woman who walked through the halls of Ravenscroft Estate with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place through suffering and emerged stronger for it. And Frederick watched her with an adoration that seemed to deepen with each passing day as autumn painted the estate in shades of amber and gold. The household staff had become her devoted allies, Mrs. Fleming fussing over her diet and rest with maternal vigilance, while the footman competed to anticipate her slightest need, and Eleanor found herself moved nearly to tears by their genuine affection, so different from the cold indifference she had known in her father's house, where Lydia's daughters had always taken precedence, and Eleanor had learned to make herself small and invisible. Frederick insisted on hiring a London physician to attend her alongside Dr. Whitmore, sparing no expense to ensure both mother and child would receive the finest care, and when Eleanor protested that such extravagance was unnecessary, he silenced her with a kiss and reminded her that she was carrying the future of his family within her, that there was nothing in his power he would not do to keep her safe and well. They spent long evenings in the library now, Frederick reading aloud while Eleanor reclined on the settee with her feet in his lap and his free hand resting protectively over the growing curve of her stomach, and sometimes she would catch him gazing at her with such wonder in his dark eyes that she had to look away for fear of weeping at the tenderness of it. Lady Harriet wrote faithfully each week with news from London, reporting with evident satisfaction that Lydia had retreated entirely from society following her humiliation at the ball, and that Lord Thomas Ashworth had taken to drink with renewed vigour, unable to face the consequences of his weakness and the daughter he had so callously betrayed. Eleanor found she could summon no satisfaction at her father's decline, only a weary sort of pity for a man who had never possessed the courage to protect those who depended upon him, and when Frederick asked if she wished to write to him, she shook her head and said that some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt, that she had found her true family now in the man who had married her in spite of her hatred, and loved her through every obstacle she had placed in his path. The child quickened for the first time on an October evening, while they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Eleanor gasped and pressed Frederick's hand against her belly so he could feel the flutter of new life within her, and when she looked up at his face, she saw tears streaming freely down his cheeks as he whispered that he had never known such happiness was possible. November settled over Ravenscroft Estate like a grey woolen blanket, bringing with it frost that silvered the windows each morning, and a biting wind that kept Eleanor confined to the warmth of the house, where fires blazed in every hearth, and Frederick had ordered extra coal brought up from the village to ensure his wife and unborn child would never feel the slightest chill. And it was during these shortened days of early winter that Eleanor found herself reflecting often on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from that rain-soaked church in June, where she had spat in the face of the man she believed to be her tormentor, to this place of profound contentment and swelling hope, where that same man now spent his evenings with his hand pressed against her rounded belly, whispering promises to the child who grew within her. The physician had pronounced her in excellent health during his weekly visit, noting with approval that both mother and baby seemed to be thriving despite the cold weather, and Eleanor had caught the look of overwhelming relief on Frederick's face each time such reassurances were offered, for she had come to understand that beneath his composed exterior lay a man who had known too much loss and feared desperately that happiness once granted might be snatched away again. Lady Harriet wrote with news that all of London was buzzing with anticipation for the birth of the Ravenscroft heir, that betting books at the gentlemen's clubs had been opened on whether the child would be a boy or girl, and that Lydia had been spotted looking gaunt and aged at a minor assembly where she had been cut by 3 ladies who had once counted themselves among her particular friends. Eleanor read these reports with neither triumph nor regret, finding that the woman who had orchestrated her forced marriage had become small and insignificant in her thoughts, a figure from another life that no longer held any power over her present joy. Frederick had begun work on the nursery in the room adjoining Eleanor's chambers, personally selecting the wallpaper and furniture with a care that touched her deeply, and when she teased him about his sudden expertise in infant accommodations, he had blushed and admitted that he had been reading every book on the subject he could find in the library, determined to be a better father than his own had been. The scar on his neck, that pale reminder of childhood suffering at the hands of a cruel man, seemed to fade a little more each day as Frederick allowed himself to believe in the family they were creating together. And Eleanor often traced that mark with gentle fingers as they lay together in the firelight, silently vowing that their child would know only love and tenderness, that the cycle of pain that had shaped both their lives would end with them. December approached with the promise of Christmas celebrations, and as Eleanor watched the first snowflakes drift past her window, she placed both hands on the curve of her stomach and smiled at the thought that by the time spring returned to paint the gardens green again, she would be holding their child in her arms, the living proof that even the most inauspicious beginnings could lead to endings more beautiful than any she had ever dared to imagine. December arrived at Ravenscroft Estate with a gentle hush of snowfall that transformed the grounds into a landscape of pristine white, and Eleanor stood at her chamber window watching the flakes drift past like tiny fragments of lace, while her hands rested upon the substantial curve of her belly where the child within had grown strong and active, kicking with such vigor that Frederick often pressed his palm against her skin simply to feel the movement and marvel at the life they had created together during that summer night when she had finally chosen him freely and completely. The estate had been transformed for the Christmas season with garlands of evergreen draped along the banisters and red ribbons adorning every doorway, while the great hall held a magnificent tree that Frederick had insisted upon cutting himself from the woods at the edge of the property, declaring that his child's first Christmas must be marked with every possible tradition and celebration regardless of the fact that the baby would not arrive until the new year had begun. Lady Harriet had travelled from London to spend the holiday with them, her presence filling the house with laughter and feminine companionship that Eleanor had not realized she missed until her dearest friend arrived with trunks full of gifts and gossip about how thoroughly Lydia's disgrace had become the cautionary tale of the season, whispered about at every gathering as an example of scheming ambition brought low by its own machinations. Philip Montague joined them on Christmas Eve, bringing with him bottles of fine wine and stories of Frederick's childhood that made Eleanor laugh until tears streamed down her cheeks while her husband pretended offense at having his youthful misadventures exposed. The Christmas morning dawned clear and bright with sunlight sparkling off the snow-covered grounds, and Eleanor woke to find Frederick already awake and watching her with such tenderness in his dark eyes that she reached for him without words, pulling him close despite the bulk of her pregnant belly, and they lay together in the quiet warmth of their shared bed while the household stirred to life around them. He had given her a necklace of emeralds to match her eyes and the gown she had worn to triumph over her enemies, but the gift that moved her to tears was a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's sonnets with an inscription in his own hand declaring that she had taught him the true meaning of every word the poet had written about love and transformation. She gave him in return a small portrait she had commissioned in secret, painted from a sketch Lady Harriet had made, showing Eleanor in her wedding dress as she had appeared on that fateful June morning when she had despised him with every fibre of her being, and when Frederick asked why she had chosen such an image, she told him that she wanted him to remember always how far they had travelled together, from hatred to love, from strangers to the family they were about to become, when their child entered the world and made everything complete.